Rejecting his fated mate was a death sentence, though Alpha King Simon didn't know it yet. As he looked down at the lowly Omega and threw her away, the collective gasp of 3,000 wolves echoed through the grand hall. He was entirely unaware that the woman he just discarded carried the only cure to his dying bloodline. The Obsidian Court, nestled deep within the unforgiving terrain of the Cascade Mountains, was a fortress masquerading as a palace. For centuries, the Montgomery family had ruled the North American werewolf packs from its shadowy halls, but on this crisp October evening, the air inside the grand estate was suffocating, thick with a secret only a handful of elites knew. Alpha King Simon Montgomery was dying. It wasn't a disease of the flesh that human doctors could detect, nor was it a wound from a battlefield. It was a genetic decay, a terrifying unraveling of the royal lichen DNA. For a decade, no pups had been born to the Montgomery line. The king's own sister, Princess Madeline, had suffered 4 tragic miscarriages before her wolf simply gave up and faded away. Simon, at 32, was the last of his kind. The grim reality had been confirmed only weeks prior by Dr. Henrik Vanderberg, the chief geneticist at the Wolfram Klein Research Facility in Zurich, a clandestine laboratory that handled the medical anomalies of the supernatural elite. Dr. Vanderberg's encrypted report had been devastatingly clear. The alpha anomaly in your blood is feeding on itself, Your Majesty. Without a mate possessing a profoundly dominant, uncorrupted genetic sequence, your lineage will suffer total cellular collapse within 5 years. You must find an alpha-blooded mate. Anything less will accelerate the decay. Driven by a desperate need to save his pack from the impending chaos of a succession war, Simon organized the Centennial Mating Gala. It was billed as a celebration of unity, but in reality, it was a high-stakes auction. Every high-ranking alpha and beta female from across the globe was flown in. Among the favorites was Lady Arabella Sterling, a ruthless, pure-blooded alpha female from the formidable London packs. She was the logical choice, the political choice, the safe choice. While the upper echelons of werewolf society drank champagne imported from Reims and danced under crystal chandeliers, Juliet Caldwell was slipping through the servants' corridors, carrying an armful of white nightshade and winter roses. Juliet, known to most simply as Evie, was an Omega. In the brutal hierarchy of the pack, she was effectively invisible. She worked in the estate's sprawling botanical gardens under the watchful eye of an elderly archivist named Arthur Pendleton. Evie didn't mind the dirt under her fingernails, or the constant, low-level disdain from the higher-ranking wolves. She found peace among the rare herbs and ancient texts. She had no aspirations of grandeur. She only wanted to drop off the floral centerpieces for the high tables and retreat to her small, quiet cabin before the full moon reached its peak. But fate, as the wolves knew well, had a cruel sense of humor. As Evie hurried past the heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom, a sudden, violent shift in the air stopped her dead in her tracks. It was as if the oxygen had been sucked from the corridor. A scent hit her: rich pine, ozone, and dark, spiced rum. It was intoxicating, primal, and terrifyingly powerful. The basket of winter roses slipped from her trembling hands, the glass vases shattering against the marble floor. At that exact moment, the oak doors swung open. Alpha King Simon strode out, his imposing, broad-shouldered frame rigid with tension, trying to escape the suffocating perfume of Lady Arabella and the political sycophants. He froze, his golden eyes, usually cold and calculating, locked onto the petite, terrified woman kneeling amidst shattered glass and crushed roses. Mate. The word wasn't spoken. It reverberated through the very marrow of their bones. The mating bond, a legendary force that hadn't graced the Montgomery line in 3 generations, snapped into place with the violence of a lightning strike. Simon felt the crushing weight of his genetic curse momentarily lift. His inner wolf howled, clawing at his mind, demanding he claim the woman on the floor. He took a slow, hypnotic step forward, his eyes drinking in her chestnut hair, her pale, frightened skin, and the worn, simple fabric of her servant's dress. "What is your name?" Simon's voice was a low, gravelly command that brooked no defiance. "Juliet," she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Juliet Caldwell, Your Majesty." Simon's beta, a towering man named Donovan Hayes, stepped out of the ballroom behind him, his eyes widening as he took in the scene. Donovan knew the scent of an Omega anywhere. He also knew the king's medical diagnosis. "Simon," Donovan murmured, his voice a tight wire of warning. "She's an Omega, a garden worker." The words acted like ice water dashed in the king's face. An Omega. Simon's mind raced, colliding with Dr. Vanderberg's dire warnings. "You must find an alpha-blooded mate. Anything less will accelerate the decay." To mate with an Omega, the lowest tier of their genetic hierarchy, a wolf with a submissive nature and fragile constitution wouldn't just fail to cure him. In Simon's mind, it would be a death sentence for them both. The mating bond would drain her to heal him, killing her, and then he would die anyway, leaving his kingdom to burn. Logic and fear violently overrode the screaming demands of his soul. He could not be selfish. He was a king before he was a wolf. The tension in the corridor had drawn a crowd. The heavy doors were now fully open, framing the spectacle for the thousands of elites gathered inside. The music had stopped. The silence was absolute, heavy with anticipation. Lady Arabella Sterling pushed her way to the front, her lips curling into a sneer as she assessed the kneeling girl. Simon looked down at Juliet. She was looking up at him with a mixture of awe, hope, and a desperate, fragile vulnerability. She felt the bond. She knew she was the queen to the most powerful wolf in the world. For a fleeting second, Simon wanted to abandon his crown, pick her up, and run deep into the mountains where the politics of their dying race couldn't reach them. But the faces of his council stared back at him. The ghosts of his dead ancestors weighed on his shoulders. Simon straightened his posture. He locked his jaw, forcing his golden eyes to ice over, suffocating his inner wolf until it whimpered in agony. "Stand up," Simon commanded. Evie slowly got to her feet, brushing off the petals from her skirt, her hands trembling. She took a step toward him, drawn by the invisible, magnetic pull of the bond. Simon took a step back. The movement was small, but it was like a physical blow to Evie's chest. "Alpha," she whispered, confusion swirling in her large, dark eyes. "I am Alpha King Simon Montgomery," his voice boomed, magically amplified to carry through the grand hall so every visiting dignitary, every elder, and every rival could hear his definitive choice. "And I am bound by duty to the Silver Peak Pack and the continuation of my line." He looked directly into Evie's eyes. He saw the exact moment her hope fractured. "I, Alpha King Simon Montgomery," he began, the ancient, ritualistic words tasting like ash and battery acid on his tongue, "reject you, Juliet Caldwell, as my destined mate." A collective gasp ripped through the ballroom. Rejecting a fated mate was a taboo so profound it was considered a sin against the moon goddess herself. It caused immense physical and psychological agony. To do it publicly was an act of unmatched cruelty. Arabella Sterling smiled, a predatory gleam in her eye. "You are an Omega," Simon continued, forcing himself to sound callous, to sever the tie completely so she would not linger and suffer. "You are too weak to bear the crown. You are too fragile to bear my heirs. My pack requires strength, and you have none to offer." With every word, the invisible tether between them violently frayed. Evie felt a searing, tearing pain in her chest, as if her heart were being physically ripped from its cavity. She gasped, stumbling backward, clutching her sternum. Blood began to trickle from her nose, but Simon was suffering too. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his hands shook. He dug his nails into his own palms until they bled, using the physical pain to mask the spiritual amputation he was committing. "Accept it," he prayed silently. "Accept it and leave, so you can survive." Evie stood in the center of the shattered glass. The humiliation was a physical weight pressing down on her. 3,000 pairs of eyes were judging her, pitying her, mocking her. She was nothing, just dirt beneath the king's expensive boots. But as the agonizing pain of the severed bond washed over her, something deeply buried within Juliet's DNA began to awaken. For 22 years, Evie had believed she was a weak Omega. What she didn't know, what no one knew, not even Arthur Pendleton who guarded the archives, was that her bloodline wasn't weak. It was dormant. Juliet Caldwell was the last living descendant of the Aurelia line, the first Lunas. Her ancestors hadn't been warriors. They had been the life-bringers, the genetic anchors who possessed a regenerative cellular structure so pure it could heal the most corrupted alpha blood. The violent shock of the king's rejection acted as a catalyst. The seal on her dormant genetics shattered. Evie stopped trembling. She wiped the blood from her lip. The fear evaporated from her dark eyes, replaced by an eerie, glacial calm that made Donovan Hayes take an involuntary step backward. She looked at Simon, not with the submissive gaze of an Omega, but with a piercing clarity that made the king's breath hitch. "I, Juliet Caldwell," she said, her voice clear and surprisingly steady, carrying effortlessly through the dead silent hall. "Accept your rejection, Alpha King Simon." The finality of the words caused a visible shockwave. The bond snapped completely. Simon staggered back, catching himself against the heavy oak doorframe, a hollow, echoing void suddenly opening in his soul. Evie didn't look at him anymore. She didn't look at the sneering Arabella or the shocked council members. She turned on her heel, her boots crunching softly over the broken glass, and walked away. "May your crown be a comfort, Your Majesty," she called back softly, the words echoing hauntingly in the corridor, "when your halls are empty." By midnight, Juliet Caldwell had packed her few belongings into a duffel bag and left the Obsidian Court. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to disappear into the human world. She boarded a Greyhound bus heading out of the Cascades, her chest aching with a hollow emptiness. But as she watched the rain lash against the window, her burner phone, a secret device given to her by Arthur, buzzed. It was a text from an encrypted international number. "The catalyst has been triggered. The king has made his choice, and in doing so, has doomed himself. Come to London, Juliet. Dr. Alistair Croft is waiting. It is time you learned who you really are." The rain in London was a relentless, icy drizzle that soaked through Juliet's thin coat as she stepped out of a black cab in front of a towering, ivy-choked townhouse in Kensington. The address Arthur Pendleton had given her belonged to a man who existed entirely off the grid of the traditional werewolf council, Dr. Alistair Croft. Croft was a legend spoken of in hushed, frightened whispers. He was a former Lycan archivist who had been exiled decades ago for suggesting that the genetic hierarchy of Alpha, Beta, and Omega was not a divine decree by the moon goddess, but a biological mutation that was slowly killing their species. When the heavy oak door creaked open, an elderly man with sharp, intelligent eyes and a silver cane stood in the foyer. He took one look at Evie, inhaled deeply, and bowed his head. "I have waited my entire life for this scent, Doctor," Croft murmured, his voice trembling with reverent awe. "Welcome home, Lady Aurelia." Over the next 3 months, Evie's world was entirely deconstructed and rebuilt within the hidden sanctuary of Croft's estate. She learned that she was not a defective, weak Omega. Her genetic sequence was simply so ancient, so fundamentally pure, that modern Lycan biology could not register it. She was a Genesis wolf. The Aurelia line was the foundational bedrock of their species. Their submissive nature was actually a biological shielding mechanism designed to protect their miraculous regenerative abilities from being exploited by power-hungry alphas. The rejection, the violent severing of the mate bond, had acted as an epigenetic trigger. Her body, sensing fatal trauma, had dropped the shield. "Your cellular structure is restructuring itself," Dr. Croft explained one evening, projecting a glowing 3D helix of her DNA in his subterranean laboratory. "You are producing the Aurelia strain. It is an enzyme that reverses the telomere degradation currently wiping out the alpha bloodlines. You are not just the cure for King Simon, Juliet. You are the salvation of our entire race." As the weeks passed, the physical changes in Evie became impossible to ignore. The frail, stooped posture of the garden servant vanished. She grew taller, her musculature aligning into a sleek, deadly grace. Her chestnut hair darkened to the color of rich, polished mahogany, and her eyes, once timid and downcast, now burned with a quiet, undeniable authority. Her scent, previously a faint whisper of winter roses, blossomed into a commanding, intoxicating aura of petrichor, crushed pine, and ancient power. She no longer felt the urge to lower her eyes to anyone. 4,000 miles away, in the Obsidian Court, Alpha King Simon Montgomery was dying. The decline was not slow, nor was it graceful. The moment he rejected Juliet, the curse in his bloodline accelerated with terrifying ferocity. The golden luster of his eyes grew dull, clouded by a sickly gray film. His imposing muscles began to atrophy, and a relentless, freezing ache settled deep into his bones. He spent his nights locked in his private chambers, coughing up black, necrotic blood into a silver basin, his inner wolf howling in ceaseless, mourning agony. The pack was in a state of barely contained panic. The council, desperate to secure a succession, practically forced Lady Arabella Sterling into Simon's chambers to complete a political mating. It was a disaster. The moment Arabella touched his skin, Simon's dying wolf seized control. Driven by the agonizing void of the severed bond, the beast viewed Arabella not as a mate, but as a foreign, parasitic threat. Simon lost his mind, shifting into his massive, terrifying lichen form. He threw Arabella across the room, his claws shredding her expensive silk gown and leaving 3 jagged scars across her collarbone before Donovan Hayes, his loyal beta, managed to tranquilize him with enough sedatives to take down a rhinoceros. The Sterling family, humiliated and enraged, withdrew their support. The North American packs were suddenly teetering on the edge of a violent civil war. The true breaking point arrived 2 days later. Dr. Henrik Vanderberg arrived at the Obsidian Court via a private helicopter, bypassing the council and storming directly into the king's heavily guarded medical wing. He carried a secure titanium briefcase. Simon was propped up in bed, an IV line feeding fluids into his pale, trembling arm. He looked like a ghost of the fearsome king he had been only a few months prior. "You fool!" Dr. Vanderberg hissed, abandoning all royal protocol as he slammed a thick file onto the king's lap. "You arrogant, blind, monumental fool." Donovan growled a warning, but Simon waved him off, his breathing shallow and ragged. "Speak plainly, Henrik. I do not have the energy for riddles." "The girl," the doctor practically shouted, his face red with a mixture of fury and scientific disbelief. "The Omega you humiliated and discarded. I took samples of the blood she left on the marble floor of the corridor." Simon flinched, the memory of Evie clutching her chest, bleeding because of his words, sending a fresh wave of excruciating pain through his chest. "I ran a deep sequencing analysis," Vanderberg continued, his hands shaking as he opened the file to reveal the genetic charts. "There were anomalies I couldn't understand at first. It took me 3 months and the help of a rogue archivist's old notes to decode it. She isn't an Omega, Simon. She is an Aurelia, a Genesis wolf." The silence in the room was absolute, heavy enough to crush bone. Donovan's jaw dropped. Simon stared at the doctor, his dulled eyes widening in horror as the gravity of the words settled over him. "She possessed the only uncorrupted regenerative genetic sequence on the planet," Vanderberg whispered, the anger draining from his voice, leaving only bleak despair. "Her blood was the exact perfect counteragent to your cellular decay. The moon goddess gave you the holy grail, the literal cure to your dying bloodline wrapped in a mate bond, and you threw it in the garbage because of a title." Simon squeezed his eyes shut. A single tear, hot and stinging, slid down his pale cheek. The tragedy of his own hubris was suffocating. He hadn't just doomed himself. He had shattered the heart of the only woman designed to complete his soul, all because he was too obsessed with the superficial optics of strength. "Where is she?" Simon croaked, his voice barely a rasp. "Gone," Donovan replied softly, looking at his tablet. "She vanished from the human grid the night she left. No financial footprint, no scent trails, nothing." Simon forced himself to sit up, ripping the IV from his arm. He ignored the alarm monitors that immediately began shrieking. He ignored the black spots dancing in his vision. "Find her," Simon commanded, the faint, desperate echo of his alpha tone rattling the windows. "Call every tracker, bribe every port authority, leverage every favor this crown possesses. I don't care if she hates me. I don't care if she kills me. I have to see her." It took another month to locate her, and by that time, Simon was running on nothing but pure, stubborn willpower. The intelligence came through a back-channel contact in London. Lady Juliet Caldwell was no longer hiding. She was set to be formally introduced to European Lichen Society at the Winter Solstice Masquerade, hosted at the prestigious Savoy Hotel by none other than Lord Benedict Sterling, Arabella's fiercely ambitious older brother. Simon, accompanied only by Donovan and a handful of elite guards, flew to London. He could barely stand. Donovan practically had to carry the king onto the private jet. Every breath was a battle against the cellular collapse, turning his organs to ash. The ballroom at the Savoy was a sea of velvet, diamonds, and dangerous politics. The European elite moved like sharks to music, and at the center of the room, holding court with an effortless, magnetic grace, was Juliet. She wore a gown of midnight blue silk that seemed to flow like liquid shadows around her legs. Her hair was swept up in an elegant style, adorned with tiny, shimmering silver pins that caught the light like stars. She was laughing softly at something a French alpha was saying, completely unbothered, radiantly powerful. When the grand doors of the ballroom were suddenly shoved open, the music screeched to a halt. Simon stood in the doorway. He wore his formal king's military regalia, the dark wool and gold epaulets, sharply contrasting with his hollow cheeks and ashen skin. The silence that fell over the room was identical to the one in the Obsidian Court months ago, but the roles were violently reversed. Evie turned slowly, her dark eyes locked onto Simon. She didn't flinch. She didn't cower. She simply watched him with an unreadable, serene expression. Simon took a step forward. His knee buckled. Donovan lunged to catch him, but Simon shoved his beta away with a fierce, trembling snarl. He had to do this alone. He dragged his heavy boots across the polished floor, every step a monumental victory against his dying body. The crowd parted, murmuring in shock and disgust at the pathetic state of the once feared Alpha King. Lord Benedict Sterling stepped into Simon's path, a cruel, triumphant smile on his face. "King Simon, you trespass on my territory, and you look terribly unwell. Perhaps it is time for the North American Pax to recognize a new, stronger ruler." Simon ignored him entirely. He pushed past the much larger Alpha, his eyes fixed only on Juliet. He stopped 3 feet away from her. The scent of her, no longer weak, but overwhelmingly potent and divine, washed over him, making his dying wolf whimper in desperate longing. "Juliet," Simon rasped. The word tore at his throat. "Alpha King," Evie replied. Her voice was smooth, cool, and devoid of the terror she had once harbored. "To what do we owe this intrusion?" Simon looked around the room. He saw the sneering faces. He saw Arabella standing in the corner, her hand resting on the scars he had given her. He saw the politics, the judgment, the exact same superficial cruelty he had prioritized over his mate. Slowly, agonizingly, Simon Montgomery, the Alpha King of the Obsidian Court, sank to his knees. Gasps erupted from the crowd. An Alpha King never bowed. He never knelt. To do so was to surrender his crown, his pride, and his life. "I was a coward," Simon spoke, his voice carrying clearly in the dead silence. He looked up at her, stripping away every ounce of his armor, exposing the raw, bleeding regret in his soul. "I let fear and ancient prejudices blind me to the gift the goddess gave me. I rejected you not because you were weak, Juliet, but because I was terrified of failing my pack. In doing so, I became the very ruin I was trying to prevent." Evie looked down at the man who had broken her. She saw the gray in his hair, the tremors in his hands, the imminent specter of death hovering over his shoulders. "I am not here to ask you to save me," Simon continued, coughing, a spatter of dark blood staining the white marble floor. "My life is forfeit, and I deserve the agonizing end that is coming for me. I crossed an ocean on my dying breath, only to do what I should have done in my own halls." He bowed his head, exposing the vulnerable nape of his neck in ultimate submission. "I beg for your forgiveness, not as a king, but as a broken wolf who lost his soul the moment you walked away." Before Evie could speak, a furious roar shattered the moment. Lord Benedict Sterling drew a concealed silver blade from his cane. "This is a pathetic display. The Montgomery line ends tonight." Benedict lunged, driving the silver blade toward Simon's exposed neck. Simon was too weak to move. He closed his eyes, accepting the final blow. But the blade never struck. A shockwave of sheer, concussive force exploded outward. It wasn't physical. It was a wall of pure, terrifying alpha command that brought every wolf in the room, including Benedict, crashing to their knees. Evie stepped in front of Simon. Her eyes were glowing a brilliant, blinding silver. The Genesis power, the dormant might of the first Lunas, flared around her like a halo. She grabbed Benedict's wrist with a grip like steel, twisting it effortlessly until the blade clattered to the floor. "You will not touch him," Evie's voice boomed, layered with a supernatural resonance that vibrated in the teeth of everyone present. "He is my mate, and his fate is mine to decide." She shoved Benedict backward, sending the massive alpha skidding across the floor. No one else dared to move. The aura radiating from her was suffocatingly powerful. Evie turned back to Simon, the silver glow slowly fading from her eyes. She knelt in front of him, her beautiful silk gown pooling in the small drops of his spilled blood. She reached out, her warm, soft hands cupping his freezing, hollowed face. "You broke me, Simon," she whispered, her voice cracking with a sudden, overwhelming emotion. "You threw me to the wolves." "I know," he cried silently, leaning into her touch as if it were the only real thing in the universe. "I am so sorry. But Doctor, Croft taught me something about the Aurelia line," Evie continued, tracing the dark circles under his eyes. "We do not destroy. We restore. Our strength is not in our fangs, but in our capacity to heal what is broken." She leaned forward. "I, Juliet Caldwell, claim you, Simon Montgomery, as my true and fated mate." She pressed her lips to his. The moment their mouths met, a violent, blinding spark of energy ignited between them. The severed bond, jagged and bleeding for months, fused back together in an instant. Simon gasped against her lips. It felt as though liquid fire was being injected directly into his veins. The Aurelia strain flooded his system. The cellular decay halted instantly. The gray film vanished from his eyes, replaced by a blinding, brilliant gold. His muscles flooded with oxygen and strength. His inner wolf, practically a corpse moments prior, roared back to life, shaking the very foundations of the Savoy Hotel. Simon wrapped his massive arms around Juliet, burying his face in her neck, pulling her into his lap as he breathed her in, whole and healed. He was no longer just a king. He was a complete being, tethered to the most powerful force their world had ever seen. He stood up, lifting Juliet effortlessly into his arms. He looked around the room. The European elites, Arabella, and Lord Benedict were all kneeling, their heads bowed, instinctively submitting to the combined, unparalleled power of a healed Alpha King and a Genesis Queen. Simon didn't say a word to them. He simply carried his mate out of the ballroom, leaving the shadows of his past behind, stepping into the cold London rain with a renewed fire in his blood. Juliet did not return to the quiet botanical gardens as a lowly servant, but as a radiant queen who shattered the chains of biology and tradition. Simon ruled with a reformed heart, forever humbled by the woman who saved his life and kingdom. Together, they rebuilt the ancient Montgomery bloodline, proving that true strength is never found in the cruelty of a title, but in the enduring grace of forgiveness.